Hello again and welcome to Catholic Social Teaching 101. We're actually, believe it or not, in our 13th segment. And we're going to be covering something today that is very, very important, not only because of the looming election that's coming up in California and in the nation on November 8th, but it's always important to learn new things about justice. We're going to be talking about something you may have once heard about, but have no clue as to what it means, or you're pretty versed in what is restorative justice. That's what we're going to be discussing with our guest today and next month. So let me introduce them and why I picked them, because they are so awesome. I have a new friend, Mark Baker, who is a professor of mission and theology at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary. Actually, it's my first time meeting Mark, but I know Lynn. And Lynn, his wife, not only told me, if you're doing a program on justice, you need to read Mark's book, and he'd be a great guest. So I want to thank Lynn, who is far away at this time.
In Honduras, yeah.
See, some people just can't stay put. They wind up, if they have a mission, they bring that to Central America. And we want to be praying for the mission and all the work that the Bakers have ever done in Central America. Now, on his side is someone that I have had on a program once before, a long time ago. It's Sheri Wiedenhoefer. And why Sheri comes in to be on our show today, good connect with Mark, who said, oh, she spoke at our church. She's really awesome. And I said, but I know Sheri because of Restorative Justice and the work with the Mennonite community. Oh, yeah, still involved in that, but in a different way. She is now working on a program that is definitely called Circles of Support and Accountability, which she'll unpack for us later. Now, our third guest is my newest connect ever. Ivan Paz is a student, graduate student of Mark's, very involved in community activism here in Fresno, is himself Salvadoran, and that puts him right up high with me because I love Oscar Romero. And I just think anybody that's Salvadoran, they're my friend.
And Mexican.
So, and Mexican also.
Yes.
You are both.
Yes.
He was born in two countries. I don't believe it. On that happy note of having us knowing who we are, let's do it all over again. Mark, tell us more about the university, your course, and your emphasis on restorative justice. How does that fit into a curriculum? How is that your passion? Why have you written about it? Tell us about restorative justice, opening thoughts.
So yeah, just how my connection between this topic and so, as you mentioned, I've written a couple books on the atonement, and one of the things that I worked on in that was trying to broaden out our understanding of what the saving significance of the cross is. And I encountered roadblocks of people accepting that, understanding that, and so one thing I worked with a lot was, well, what does this word justice mean in the Bible? And so in one sense, I come at this topic of restorative justice through studying the biblical text and what the word means. But matched with that, I lead a Bible study in the county jail every Friday, and so
captive audience?
I've experienced, through hearing men's stories in jail, the downside of a system that doesn't practice restorative justice. So I have both academic things that bring me to this topic as well as personal experiences and passion.
What is it, Sheri, that would be your connect with this topic as maybe different than Mark's?
Restorative justice was a new to me when I was at Fresno Pacific University. That's where I learned of it. Ron and Roxanne Clausen, the classic restorative justice people from Fresno that are well known in this area. So I got my master's degree in conflict and peacemaking there at Fresno Pacific University and had been exposed to restorative justice principles all along. So I worked with school districts and I worked in community-based program for youth in particular. So I began to understand the school-to-prison pipeline. And that was an awareness for me with the variety of people I was encountering, things I was learning. So now I find myself, I started with schools, neighborhoods, communities, and now I find myself at the end of the pipeline, which is people coming out of prison. And the end of the pipeline has as much or more opportunity than any of those other courses along the line there. So my interest is just in how restorative justice can help transform our criminal justice system, but mostly ourselves and our communities as well.
Finally, Ivan, what is your entry point? What is the point that, as we start our conversation, is a great grounding for you to connect to what we're doing?
Yeah, I think the first time I became familiar with the concept of restorative justice, I was also a student at Fresno Pacific as an undergrad studying criminal justice studies. And it was just really like a revolutionary idea for me, because all my life, I would say that I've kind of lived under an understanding of justice that was retributive. And I saw the consequences of that, not only in our, as a juvenile who had an experience with the criminal justice system, I not only saw that in my interactions with the criminal justice system, but I think it was almost a perspective that was assumed by many of my neighbors, as well as people that I was growing up with. And I saw how that kind of understanding influenced a generation of young people growing up in the inner city. And I think I became even more of an advocate for restorative justice when I began to write my thesis about a year ago, I think. I did a lot of research on patterns of urban violence and its link to several different, I would say, social myths, including the idea of retributive justice. And so I've just become a big fan for the alternative.
Mark, can you help unpack something? Because we're putting two words out that sound great, and they are, but they maybe should be unpacked right away. Retributive justice. Help us see what, if something's retributive, what is it? And if something's restorative, unpack those if you could, and then others can add on, but crack it open, Mark.
So retributive, I think, in the sense of punishment. And so retributive justice would have an emphasis on punishment. And I think a big difference is in retributive justice, one, there's been punishment, then we say justice has been done. So it sort of captures, it's about punishing. Where restorative justice could actually have some elements in it that you might view as punishment, but the objective is not, the end point is not just to punish and you're done, but to make things right. So I think in a simple sense, I'd contrast them as saying making right versus punishing.
Sheri, in your experience with this pipeline, where have those two terms become evidenced, seen, witnessed, suffered through, like regretted that, oh my, we're just stuck in retributive justice here? An example, and then Ivan, same thing. Yeah. In your life, in your work.
Well, and I think that's been the most phenomenal part of the work, is to see the outcomes of that. I think retributive and restorative justice, you work sometimes hand in hand, as Mark had mentioned, but there's a big difference when you commit a crime in this country, because your crime is against the state, not against the person that you've committed the crime with. So the victims are underserved, and the offenders never meet their victim. So they don't understand the impact of the crime. They don't understand the impact on that community. If I look at a young juvenile offender, for instance, a young juvenile offender commits a crime. That crime affects that family, that community, that teacher, that school, that church. The ripple effect is incredible. And so that's where the injury has occurred. So when you do restorative justice and those kinds of situations, you understand that the whole community needs healing as a result of that act. And you become more of a family in terms of responding to that crime. So it's a big difference between having a crime against a state that will punish you and oftentimes seeks vengeance in that punishment, and a crime against a person which needs to be healed in an environment that needs to be healed as a result of that to increase public safety.
So Ivan, in your experience, in your work, study, and personal life, where do you see these two lining up? Where have they become super clear to you, the difference?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's there's a lot of reflection that has been put in regard to this topic, and I would say that even when I wrote my thesis, I think I did a lot of. I try not to focus so much on my personal life. Try to stick to the academics of it all, but it was still personally like inevitable for me to like engage some of those memories. And I would say that the best example I can give you is a personal one. So in this way, I'm making myself pretty transparent with all of you. But I think as I reflect on this concept of retributive justice, I just now remember like growing up without even questioning the concept. It's almost like it's assumed, it's taken for granted, and in the way from the way society tries to define a justice to the point of the parents, like even my parents, like, you do something wrong, I'm going to correct you, the belt, right, or the chancla, right? So that the concept of retributive justice was very much alive for me growing up, and I think it was continually reinforced by what we saw on television, the police officers in our neighborhood, and then when I started getting involved in the wrong things, going through the criminal justice system, and I think when I reflect though, I recognize how much that way of thinking has impacted the kinds of neighborhoods that I'm now an activist in. When people are in some ways disenfranchised from the system that is supposed to provide justice, oftentimes people who assume that justice is retributive yet don't trust the system itself will oftentimes seek to attain what they understand as justice, which is really retributive justice. They'll try to seek it out with their own hands. And I think that way of living out justice was very much a part of my life growing up, and so it got me into a lot of trouble on the streets. I don't know if that...
No, this is very personal what you're all sharing, because it's partly academic study, and it's partly personal experience, and it's working with people who are the victims of this system. And what was really clear to me, and maybe Sheri can go deeper into it, and Mark and Ivan join in, the idea that the victims themselves are not served by this system, which seems to be counterintuitive, because the whole object seems to be the package is saying, let justice be done. And until this is punished, I cannot breathe. I need to know that's been done. But it doesn't seem that doesn't seem to do it. And now they're telling me that justice is done, we take a break. I hate that when they do that. We're going to take a break, but when we come up, we'll decide which one of you wants to look at unpacking the idea that even victims are victims of the system again. It fails us all. We'll be back in a minute.
Celebrate Sunday Mass with KNXT from beautiful St. Anne's Chapel every Sunday at 7:30 a.m. and again at 5 p.m. This weekly broadcast of the Sunday Mass has become the cornerstone of diocesan evangelization, touching thousands of viewers, both Catholic and non-Catholic alike, with the Word of God and the Liturgy of the Eucharist. Sunday Mass from St. Anne's Chapel, 7:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. on KNXT TV, your Catholic television station.
We just are coming back from our break, and we left at a very important moment. The victims themselves, not so well served. Sheri, can you clarify that and maybe give us an example of why? Well, for sure, that's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I'll talk about it in a larger context of Fresno. Fresno is well known for its restorative justice in the criminal justice system in our juvenile court. So kids that come through the juvenile court have an option when they come through court with their offenses to mediate that and to take care of that outside of the court without. If they complete that agreement that they make in the restorative justice agreement, they will not get charged. So they will resolve it outside of that. But it's judges are in on this, the probation department, everybody's in on this. They just did a study of this program. The Berkeley University did a study of this program. Here's one of the outstanding, of the many outstanding things from this study, was that victim satisfaction is across the board very positive.
Wow.
Family satisfactions, the offender satisfactions, off the charts. Satisfaction as if justice has been served. And I'm going to tell you one statistic that Judge Gottlieb quoted last night in this study. 100% of restitution was made. Not to the state of California, but to victims themselves. That's part of the difference of a restorative approach to a retributive approach, because we're not paying fees to a court. That's very uninspiring for a juvenile who has graffitied somebody's backyard and never understood the impact of that graffiti on that backyard. Because they're paying the state, they're going to the state, they're having to pay their fees. So I don't have the stat on that, but the return rate years ago with Victim Offender Reconciliation Program was about 80% of kids that went through the VORT program, the Victim Offender Mediation Program, didn't reoffend, and about 80% who did not did. The difference in terms of recouping the cost, well, when you're recouping the cost for a family that's had to redo their fence and had to do all that, you understand that, there's compassion there. So do you see why there would be so much more satisfaction if you're dealing with the actual crime? The other thing that's reported by victims is their fear is gone. They no longer feel fear because they knew who the person was. They understood why that juvenile did that, and they begin to restore their own sense of self and their own sense of dignity in their home or in their property. Makes sense, doesn't it?
It does, and one thing, when you mentioned Judge Gottlieb, I want to remind our viewers that we actually have Judge Gottlieb coming on the 20th of October to the diocese to share his reflections on the importance of restorative justice in the juvenile system, which he is so committed to. Nice to mention Judge David Gottlieb, who is such a giant in this area. I wonder if Mark can re-enter our little conversation here with any light from your research and study, a book or two, on this very issue that we're on right now, or do we already make an inroads into atonement theology? Is this a...
Yeah, so let me pick up what Sheri was just saying. So she was talking, I think, okay, the difference between our Western criminal justice system's concept of justice, in which where would the victim be? The victim can go to court, but would be a spectator like anyone else. Whereas in restorative justice, the victim is part of the process. And if we go biblically, in the Hebraic understanding of justice, it's like restorative justice. It's like VORP, that if you're before the judge in the Old Testament, then both victim and offender there, and the judge's role, like here, is to figure out guilt or innocence, but then to work for restoration, restitution of relationships. So I think what's tragic is that there is, back to something Ivan said about, there's this myth of redemptive violence. So there's a sense of violence will solve things, and unfortunately that is fed by very common atonement theology. And so atonement means bringing together, bringing at one, salvation through the cross. And so a very common atonement theology feeds this myth. And it's kind of the idea, well, if God punished Jesus on the cross and great things came from that, well, we'll keep doing the same. And I just, to bring this into the topics we're talking about, and even relating it to, election propositions this year. I was reading in a Christian magazine last month. So there was a book review on a book about the death penalty, and this was arguing that Christians should be opposed to the death penalty. And someone wrote a letter in and saying, in essence saying, I'm sorry, it's a good argument, but retributive justice stands at the heart of the gospel, without which God cannot be just, and who justifies. And then saying, so, the death penalty, it makes sense because God self did this. So I want to unpack it a little bit. The person says, retributive justice is at the heart of the gospel, without which God can't be just. So a key thing is, well, what's it mean for God to be just? And this is where I think there's this unhealthy symbiotic relationship between our justice system and this one particular kind of atonement theology. They feed off of each other. And it's this view that justice means to punish. And the Hebraic sense of justice is much more relational. It's to be faithful to your commitments. So one way of viewing it is through the cross, God is just because God carries out the law and punishes. The other view would be say God is just because God keeps God's commitments to bring salvation. Okay, so I just said, this common atonement theology, but I think understandably a listener could be saying, well, but if that's what the theology is, we have to accept that. And what I like to do is just very briefly give you a history lesson on atonement theology. So again, this is how the cross provides salvation. For the first 1,000 years of church history, if you'd have asked a theologian, a priest, how does the cross save? It would have said, the cross saves by through the cross, God triumphs over death, evil, and sin. And then just after 1,000, Anselm came up with a new way of talking about the cross, and it was a satisfaction theory of atonement. And the key thing here was Anselm did his thinking about atonement in his medieval court system. And he said, it's God, he didn't say justice, it's honor being satisfied. And then the next step was a few centuries later, we go to what our more court system now, and people started thinking about the cross and biblical justice language in terms of our court system, which is retributive justice. So again, that was very quick. What I want you to feel is the way many people talk about the cross right now, like this person in the letter, that the cross is God punishing Jesus so that God could be just and forgive us, is, in terms of Christian history, is a relatively new idea, 400 or 500 years. But what happens is people think if God needs to do this, then, well, appropriately, we do it as well. And then on the other hand, if you ask someone reading their Bible, they see this word justice. What's justice? Well, back to what Ivan said. In our society, in our world, in our court system, justice means doing what the law says, getting revenge, settling scores in that way. So our justice system leads us to view the atonement as a means of punishment, and then our atonement theology reinforces this idea of retributive justice. So I think if we can peel that away and go back to the Bible and look at the rich atonement theology that is in there and find there are really wonderful tools we have in theology that support restorative justice, and we can see the cross as actually, in its essence, restorative rather than retributive.
Lynn did warn me that this would be so helpful, meaning it is opening up a real possibility to see things differently. It would be so important that I think our churches preached such a theology, and I wonder if Sheri and Ivan can share if they, in the pews, in their own Bible study, are finding out that what Mark is proposing is sort of like so groundbreaking that it's not their experience much on Sundays. Or is it? So can you share, how has this worked for you in your preaching? Have you heard this? Has it been, which is reinforced, retributive or restorative?
Can I go first?
Yeah, either one.
Well, that's a good question.
I always have good questions.
Yeah. What I think is we struggle with discovering our ethics or what we believe based on what's going on in our society or basically what's going on in our faith, and it's always a tension, it's always a balance. So I feel like the church where I'm drawn to, for instance, Sister Helen Prejean says very clearly, hey, Christ on the cross is one-arm victim, one-arm offender. He meets both of those standards as victim and offender. Some people saw him as a victim, some people saw him as offender. So Christ on the cross is actually representing that whole. And, you have a lot of scripture that has that. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Any of us that break the smallest bit of the law are guilty of the whole law, right? So once you get into those kinds of things. But I do feel like for the churches that I attend, we tend to focus on having right theology, but maybe not so much on the right relationship part. Maybe if we could combine some of that together more fully. But I think there's an attempt at both, but restorative justice in a way brings a whole to that. How can we be right about our experience? How can we be right about what we know? But how also can we be in right relationship to make things as right as possible? And I think that's a good combination of good church in that way.
We are almost wrapping up the program. They're going to tell me in a minute, 2 minutes or 1 minute, they're going to tell me something short. So, Ivan, your experience being in the pews, reading Scripture the way it's taught to you, what message are you getting about the crucifixion of Jesus?
Yes. Well, Jim, I think a lot of my theological focus has been mostly on Protestant theological anthropology, and I think I've been very blessed to have Mark Baker as an instructor who's really kind of opened my understanding as to the relationship between penal substitutionary atonement and criminal justice practices. And I think what I've done in my personal thinking is I've gone a little bit more specific, and I've asked why this pattern of retributive justice tends to slam people of color, particularly the poor, even harder than the general population. And I think this is kind of the thoughts that have been occurring in my mind, but I have often thought that if penal substitutionary atonement is the theological idea that reinforces retributive justice in our criminal justice practices, then an understanding of the human as being ontologically sinful is what narrows down a target on people of color. Because if you ask people, where does crime occur the most in your city, right? They usually think of the inner city, and if you ask the same question about sin, they will point to the same direction. So in some ways, those two notions of criminality and notions of ontological sinfulness tend to be associated with each other, bringing down a retributive fist on that context.
We will be back next time and develop more about how racism is a deep part of our criminal justice system. Till next time, God bless.